It's me again, Sloane. Um, Today I wanted to talk about another one of my children. I know, I have so many of them. I only birthed four, by the way. Um, the other four or five kind of showed up at my doorstep and decided, we're keeping you, that's it, you're our mom. And so there's that. I say that as a bad joke, but it kind of happened that way, and they grew on me like a fungus. And uh, yeah, I grew to love those children who are not children anymore. They're all rather grown and insane, but my love for them grew because they became part of this insane family dynamic thing that we have going on in this household. That being said, um, recently the anniversary of the overdose of one of my children just passed, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't. It's her second anniversary, so it's not a date that I am used to preparing myself for beforehand and just kind of like trying to push through the day. Right. Chastity. Ned. Ned. We're going to call her Ned. Because the whole thing, okay, so she showed up at my door, and, well, rewind past that. I had known her for about 6 or 7 years. She was a neighborhood girl, and she had her problems or whatever, but we knew each other well enough, and I liked her enough, and she was sweet enough or whatever. But she was dating this guy, and this guy is about his drugs, and he wants to prove to the gangsters in the neighborhood that he is also tough and gangster, whatever. He's also physically abusive. I had my past with that sort of situation, and so I've been there and done that, and I understood her and where she was coming from when she did eventually show up at my door in the middle of 3 o'clock in the morning. I was watching a movie because I'm an insomniac and I almost never sleep. So I was up when she showed up at my door, barefoot, crying, covered in bruises, and with her hair caked in blood. I let her in because she literally had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, because everyone had pretty much cut her off because she had spent the last 5 or 6 years dating this guy, and everyone was tired of sheltering her after the storm that was him beating the shit out of her. I've been there and done that, so I understood what it meant to have a safe harbor in that sort of tempest. And I gave her that. Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because I had been there and done that, and I knew she needed it. I handed her a towel and a nightgown, and I told her she was going to stay the night, and I wasn't going to ask her any questions. When she came out of the shower, she started to brush her hair, and she was crying because she couldn't get the hairbrush through her hair. So she asked me to cut it all off. Now, she had gorgeous hair, long, thick curls, and I saw no need to do that to her. So I sat her down in front of me, and I told her I would brush her hair out, and I did, because I have daughters, and I've been able to get through rats' nests in their hair over the years. So I was able to detangle her hair without having to cut it all off. And while she sat there and I was brushing her hair, she told me everything. I didn't ask. She volunteered everything. And I sat quietly and I just listened while I brushed her hair. After I brushed her hair, she turned around and she asked if it was okay if she spent the night. And I looked at her like, I had already assumed she was going to, and I told her, listen, I don't know how long you need to stay here, but you've got my couch for as long as it takes for you to get settled somewhere, or until you need until you find something more stable, something better. That lasted about a year and change. I didn't expect it to. I really didn't. I thought, you know, because she was always talking about her family, her aunts, her uncles, her cousins. I thought that maybe one of them would step up and take care of her. Little by little, I found out that growing up, her mother had abandoned her with her grandmother, her grandparents, because her mother was a street kid. You know, she was a drug dealer, and she loved making money off of dealing drugs and selling her body. She didn't have time, patience, or care for having a child, so she left it to her parents to deal with. The girl's father, Ned's father, was in Florida, and according to Ned, he had sexually abused her as a child and allowed his friends to do so as well. I didn't know that at first. That I found out later on during the time that she was staying here. He came back to New York later. We'll get there. Because I did eventually meet him. But while she was staying with me, she had her moments of ups and downs. Now, when she was with this guy, Patrick, he was feeding her drugs on a rather regular basis. And he was also violating her and manhandling her in ways that should never be done to anybody, especially by someone who says that they love you. Well, her father had abandoned her and gone to Florida, and her mother was nowhere to be found. I was literally the only place that she had, the only harbor that she had. And I took her in and I cared for her, and we bonded like mother and child. We did laundry together, we cooked together every single day. We would do makeup and hair together, get dressed together in the mornings. We would go out together. We would spend time with my family, which I started introducing her to little by little, getting her in as part of our family. And she was integrating very well with everyone. During that time, however, while we were home, there would be times where she would go to the store and take 2 hours because Patrick, the guy who lives a block and a half away from me, she would run into him or seek him out, or he would seek her out, because it was mutually destructive. They would spend time together and talk and reminisce, and he would feed her more drugs, and she would come home high. I'm not an anti-drug person. I'm not. If you use it recreationally, use it recreationally. My stepdad, my adoptive father, taught me at a very early age and not to be judgmental. People do drugs. Some people do drugs. It doesn't become a problem until the drugs start doing the person. When the person is no longer doing the drugs and the drugs are doing the person, the drugs become the problem for the person because they're living for the drugs are doing them. Everything in their life revolves around the drugs. The drugs aren't a small factor of the person's life like cigarettes might be or a cup of coffee might be. The drugs become like food or air to the person or water to the person. They become a necessity. That's when it becomes a problem. I've always had that kind of mindset. So when it was a once in a while thing, I didn't care. It wasn't a real big deal to me. When it became a problem, it was because it was a money situation where she would take money from the house to go do groceries and come back with drugs and tell me, well, she'll go out and borrow money from someone else later and do groceries with it. And she never got around to that because she was high. That's when it started becoming a problem. And then she would steal, not as blatantly as, here, I'm going to go grocery shopping. It would be more, she would take my ATM card, and my bank account would be missing a couple of, $100 here or there. It became a bit ridiculous because the drugs became more of a problem for her because she had no control over the drugs. The drugs controlled her. She did not control the drugs, and that became the problem. I found her a guy, and during that time she was very happy, and she was clean, and she was sober, and she was doing really, really well. That guy then found out that she had had issues with drugs at one point, and then because he had a past with drugs, he dumped her unceremoniously because he's a hypocrite. See, he couldn't deal with her past with drugs because he had a past with drugs, and so therefore he couldn't trust her or deal with her, even though at that time she was clean, and because of him she was staying clean. But because he dumped her in the way that he did, for the reasons that he did, she turned right back to drugs and started hanging out with Patrick on a regular basis all over again. I want to stop here for a minute because I want to backtrack to a moment that happened between me and her. Because it's not backtracking. Happened right after she broke up with, the guy broke up with her. And she and I were sitting down to eat. I've always had a battle with anorexia and bulimia. And we could smell our own. I knew she was avoiding eating, and it had been 2 days since both of us had eaten, and so I made us food. And I gave her a small portion, I gave myself a small portion, and we sat down at the table to eat. Now, she did the same thing that I used to do when I was forced to eat, which is you shift the food on the plate around so that it looks like it's been touched, but it really hasn't been touched. I finished eating my plate, and I told her that she could not leave the house until she finished eating her plate. Now, she was 23, 24 at the time, and she looked at me like, you're absolutely out of your fucking mind, lady. Like, no. And I told her, well, listen, honey, I don't work like most moms do. I'm okay with blackmail, and emotional blackmail is the best. If you don't finish eating your food, I will call your 2 most recent ex-boyfriends, and I will have them come and sit here and watch you and make sure that you eat, because they will not move until you're done. And I have no problems with doing so. I have both of their numbers. Would you like me to dial? And don't you know, she was done with that plate in about 5 or 10 minutes. I don't like to attack my children. I don't like to hit my children. I don't like to torture my children. But I do like to find effective ways of making them do what is necessary. And emotionally blackmailing her with her 2 most recent ex-boyfriends was what got her to eat. Well, then that's what I needed to do. And so I did. And it worked. Thankfully. I didn't have to use it often, and I didn't really have to threaten her often, but because she knew what type of threats that I used, she started to step in line a little more often. And this worked out better for us. Until her and Patrick started getting along again. And until she started going back into the drugs again. And she started stealing again. And we started getting to fights regularly. Now, the stealing, I probably would have let go on longer because I love her, because she's my kid, because I was trying my best to get her off of the drugs, and I knew that stealing was a byproduct of the drugs, and had she gotten off the drugs, she wouldn't be stealing, and therefore the problem would have been solved. But that's the thing with addicts, so you can't solve addiction. You can't fix addiction. Addiction is a permanent problem because it's a sickness. One morning, she was in the hallway downstairs with Patrick in my home, in my building. And they were talking, cuddled up right by my mailbox, thinking that they weren't going to be seen. And they were. And it became a big thing, and there was a huge fight. And I told her that if I saw her here in my home that day, later that day, that I was going to beat the shit out of her if I saw her fucking face, because she had brought Patrick to my building again. Now, I didn't mean it. It was first thing in the morning, and there was a lot of shouting, and there was a lot of fighting. I had been woken up by the fighting. So I was speaking pretty much out of my ass. But she knew that I was angry, and she left. I didn't see her again for a while, a couple months. It was New Year's Day. I want to say a couple months later. And my niece finds out that, because my sister, wonderful person, lied to her about who her father was. And we found out who her real father was. We kind of tracked him down, and on January 1st, 3 years ago, she found out that her father had another daughter whose name was Chastity, and happened to be my kid. Yeah, the abusive father shows up. Prodigal father returns, right? So I went down the block to Patrick's home, and I yelled through the window until I got her to answer and come with me. Because I wasn't going to go upstairs. I wasn't going to knock on the man's door. I wasn't going to fight with him. I had no problem. I had nothing to do with him. I wanted nothing to do with him. My point in going over there was to get her to come over so she could meet her little sister, so they could have some sort of relationship. Because my niece deserved that. And maybe by finding her little sister, maybe by becoming part of my family in this way, she could find a way to clear herself, her mind, and everything, and become the girl I knew she could be. She didn't. And a whole big hullabaloo happened, and Patrick tried to kick open my front door with a gun in his hand on that day. This is why I remember. It was New Year's Day. And we had an altercation. And for the next year, she continued to keep in touch with my niece and tried to make peace with me, but not directly making peace with me. She would make comments to my niece and send messages to me, and then get mad when I wouldn't return with overtures of, oh my God, bring my baby back home again. I'm not a highly sentimental person that way, so it wouldn't have occurred to me to be that way. Two years ago, my niece called me and told me that she was with her father, and they were on their way to identify my daughter's body because she had overdosed on fentanyl. That's the thing about addicts. You're kind of always waiting for that other shoe to drop. When you love an addict, you're always waiting for that inevitable phone call where you have to ready that stiff upper lip because you knew it was going to happen, because it's an eventuality. Of all my children, she was probably one of my most problematic. The most problematic, probably. But in saying that, she was also probably one of the ones who were most like me, in that when I was younger, I was quite self-destructive. Not that I ever took to drugs, because it was just never a thing that I had any interest in, but I dated men like the men she dated. I put myself in those situations because I thought that that's what love meant. I was afraid that nobody loved me, and I kept myself in those situations because I thought that that was what it meant to be loved. And I know that that's what she did. And I know that she assumed that nobody loved her because that's what I always assumed. And I still at times find myself feeling that way. I know better, but she never grew up enough to know better. And while I know better, there's still that feeling that overcomes you, because your emotions and your mind are not in the same place. And they're not always going to be in the same place. As a matter of fact, most of the time, they're always going to be in conflict. And so I know in my mind that I am loved and I am cared for, and people would be affected if I were to pass. But emotionally speaking, when you isolate yourself in the ways that I do a lot, you feel that because you don't have interaction with these people on a regular basis, you feel that since you're not there, since you're not part of their day-to-day, that you feel that since you don't have a daily impact on their lives, that you have no impact on their lives, and so that it's not going to matter when you pass. It's not going to matter if you disappear tomorrow, because it doesn't matter now because you're not there and they're still surviving without you. You know what I mean? So emotionally and mentally, there's always going to be some sort of conflict there. The same way, emotionally and mentally, there's a conflict in my head going on where I still feel that part of me feels that had I not had that fight with her, had I not pushed her away, maybe she would have been here. Maybe I could have gotten her clean and sober. Maybe she would still be alive today. And I know that, again, mentally, I understand that that's not how it works. She's an addict, or she was an addict, and she would have found a way. And if it wasn't there, it would have been here. Or it would have been later on, but it would have happened. Because she needed to make the changes she needed for herself. It's not something I could have been able to do for her. So rational mind says this, and I understand that. But emotionally speaking, my emotions are saying, you turned your back on her, you kicked her out, you put her out in the streets, and you let her feel unloved. She turned to those drugs because you let it happen. And so there's that conflict constantly going on. I said that she was most like me because she was. Her attitude, her freedom, her joie de vivre. She was also, I gave her a nickname. This family, this house, we tend to give people names that suit them. That day that I threatened her with her exes, I named her accidentally because I told her that she was just like me, a bundle of neurosis and eating disorders. And that got shortened to Ned, neurosis, eating disorders. The acronym became her name, Ned. And it was a secret thing between me and her for a while until other people in the house started going, what the fuck is Ned? Why are you calling her Ned? And so after I embarrassed herself in front of, I embarrassed her in front of a couple of her siblings with, well, it's because, and I explained neurosis and eating disorders, and they were like, oh, well, that fits. And because the name fits so well, they turned around to me and said, well, you know, she's your junior, right? That makes her Princess Ned Jr., which makes me Ned, apparently. So that is who she is and always will be to me. Princess Ned. My Princess Ned. Ned Jr.